From adapting one of George R.R. Martin's lesser-known works to adding some more backstory to the Targaryen dynasty, here's everything we know about the new Game of Thrones prequel, The Hedge Knight. Starting off with the source material that the show's based on. Specifically, the novella series is called The Tales of Dunk and Egg. Hardcore Martin fans probably already know what I'm talking about, but in case you're a more casual Game of Thrones nerd, let me fill you in real quick. You see, A Song of Ice and Fire isn't the only book series Martin has created about Westeros.
You'll get them back. I swear it. Have a safe journey, Your Grace.
Once the fantasy epic took off, Martin started to work on some smaller scale stories as well. Now, even if you've never heard of the novellas, you've probably heard of the central characters. Dunk and Egg are nicknames for the pair that the novellas revolve around. Sir Duncan the Tall is the eponymous Dunk in this duo, but you'll never guess who the character of Egg secretly is. The first book reveals that he's actually Aegon Targaryen. There are quite a few characters that go by that name, but the one depicted in these novels is actually Aegon V. Just to be clear, he's the grandfather of Aerys Targaryen, also known as the Mad King, aka the guy who ended up being the last of the Targaryen line. Before you start thinking that this show is a direct prequel, Aegon is still a young boy in the series, so he's still a long way from being king. The series is set about 90 years before the events of Game of Thrones. A lot will happen over the course of the next century, but this show's not going to be the sprawling epic that Game of Thrones was. At least, not if they stay true to the source material.
I knocked him down with the hammer. Gods, I was strong then. Caved in his breastplate.
You see, The Tales of Dunk and Egg has a way lighter tone. It's still set in the grim, violent landscape of Westeros, but the story it tells is a lot more personal. The emphasis is on the relationships between Duncan and Aegon. That's actually a pretty important plot line, because Duncan ends up being Lord Commander of Aegon's Kingsguard. Now, the way the characters appear in the story is kind of interesting. They're larger-than-life figures by the time Daenerys Targaryen is born, but in the novellas, they're still learning the ropes.
You are as fit as anyone I know. You know why I'm here. And you know who will suffer the most if this all falls apart. So, what do you think?
Duncan's depicted as being kinda naive, and Aegon's main claim to fame is that he's too short to be a squire. That's a far cry from the mythical view that Game of Thrones era Westeros has of them.
You are the challenge! You are the challenge, Aegon! Simply by living and breathing!
Which makes it all the more interesting to see how they'll turn into the legends they become. That said, some of you might be wondering how the heir to the Targaryen throne ended up being a lowly squire. Well, you've gotta understand, Aegon wasn't the firstborn son. In fact, he was the fourth son of King Maekar I. This raises the question, how on earth did he end up becoming king? Well, that's actually gonna be a huge part of the series. One of Aegon's many names is Aegon the Unlikely, and some even called him Aegon the Fortunate. That's mostly because no one could have imagined that he would end up king. Aegon himself was perfectly okay with that, because he was content being the squire to a knight like Duncan. But as fate would have it, two of his brothers were tragically struck down before his time. His only remaining brother refused to take the throne, which made Aegon literally the only man for the job. Oh, and that older brother that didn't want to be king, his name was Aemon Targaryen, and we've actually seen the character portrayed on Game of Thrones. He was none other than Maester Aemon of the Night's Watch. Yep, you heard that right. The older brother of the upcoming prequel's protagonist ended up becoming Jon Snow's wise ally on the Wall.
And dark things will come with it.
We've been capturing wildlings. More every month. They're fleeing south. The ones who flee
We actually find out the truth about his legacy right before he dies, but the show doesn't really expand on his backstory. Instead, we only learn that he was in line for the Targaryen throne. Aemon was more of a nerd than any of his brothers. All he wanted was to be a maester, and maesters usually don't leave their jobs, even if it means giving up the throne.
Half the men hate you already, Lord Commander. Do it.
But you don't know what it is.
That doesn't matter.
The thing is, Aegon was a pretty trailblazing ruler, so Aemon chose to exile himself at the Wall by joining the Night's Watch. It was the only way to make sure that he didn't become some usurper's puppet. The point is, we already have at least one Game of Thrones character who's definitely going to show up. That makes this series a more direct prequel than House of the Dragon. It also acts as a midpoint between the two shows, featuring a boy who calls himself Egg. Now, Dunk has no idea that he's in the presence of royalty, and some pretty compelling adventures ensue. There are 3 novellas in the series so far, with the other 2 entries being named The Sworn Sword and The Mystery Knight. All 3 were published in a compendium called A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, which happens to be the main name of the upcoming series. This tells me that we're going to get at least 3 seasons of content, or who knows, maybe the showrunners will split each novel up into multiple seasons. Either way, they have a massive burden on their shoulders, cause the legacy of the entire Game of Thrones franchise is at stake.
But instead of being by my side or near us, you chose to celebrate your own rise! Laughing with your and your leg spittles!
Look, Game of Thrones was an absolutely revolutionary series when it first came out. We were living through the golden age of television, and it's safe to say that the release of this fantasy epic represented the peak of that era. Unfortunately, those awful last couple of seasons marred its otherwise flawless legacy. Barely anyone talks about the show anymore because of how disappointingly it ended. House of the Dragon has done a decent job of improving its reputation, and with The Hedge Knight, HBO has a chance to redeem the franchise in the eyes of the fans. They seem to be banking pretty hard on Game of Thrones spin-offs. Remember, there's also that sequel series that'll focus on Jon Snow after he rejoins the Night's Watch. Personally, I'm looking forward to both of these spin-offs. Snow will continue the legacy of the original Game of Thrones series, while The Hedge Knight looks like it'll be more related to House of the Dragon. One thing's for sure, we're going to be seeing way more dragons in the near future. That's all the info you need on A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, The Hedge Knight.